organization operating out of the hills and valleys of southern Lebanon, assembling drones from components you could order online, strapping rocket-propelled grenades onto them, and systematically hunting down the most advanced tanks that Western military engineering has ever produced. This is the story of how warfare changed, quietly, cheaply, devastatingly, and how the Israeli military, for all its brilliance, for all its technology, for all its decades of dominance, woke up in 2026 to a battlefield it had never truly prepared for. This is death from above. To understand what is happening right now in southern Lebanon, you need to understand what the Merkava tank actually is. The name itself, Merkava, means chariot in Hebrew, and it was not just a military project. It was a national obsession, a declaration. Israel began designing the Merkava in the 1970s after being rattled by tank losses in the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Egyptian and Syrian forces had used Soviet-supplied anti-tank missiles to devastate Israeli armored columns. The trauma ran deep. Israel decided it would never again be caught unprepared. The Merkava was built from the ground up with one obsessive priority: keeping the crew alive. Unlike most tanks in the world that place the engine at the rear, the Merkava moved its engine to the front. Why? Because if an anti-tank missile comes at you head-on, it hits the engine block first. The engine becomes a shield. The crew survives. It was a radical idea. Military engineers around the world called it unconventional. Israel called it necessary. Over the decades, the Merkava evolved through 4 generations. By the time we reached the Merkava Mark IV, the version currently deployed across southern Lebanon, it is arguably the most survivable tank on the planet. It carries composite armor of classified specification. It carries the Trophy Active Protection System, a radar-guided defense that can detect incoming missiles and rockets and shoot them out of the sky in the fraction of a second before they hit the vehicle. It weighs over 65 tons. It costs approximately $4 million per unit. It is the crown jewel of Israel's ground forces. It is the physical embodiment of Israeli military doctrine. Overwhelming power, technological superiority, and above everything else, the protection of the soldier inside. And Hezbollah is killing them with drones that cost a few $100s each. That is not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. That is the documented, verified, cold reality of what is happening on the ground in Lebanon right now. Let us talk specifics. Let us talk numbers. Let us follow the timeline of how this campaign unfolded, because the story is more chilling and more revealing than any headline has captured. March 2026. Israel relaunches major military operations in Lebanon. This is not the first time these two forces have clashed. The history between Israel and Hezbollah is long, bloody, and deeply personal. They fought in 2006 in a war that stunned the world when Hezbollah held its ground against one of the most powerful armies in the region. They clashed again through 2023 and 2024 when Hezbollah opened a northern front in solidarity with Hamas after the October 7th attacks. A ceasefire came in November 2024. It held barely for a little over a year. But by early 2026, the situation had collapsed again. Hezbollah began rebuilding its militant infrastructure. Israel cited over 15,000 ceasefire violations. And on March 2nd, the shooting started again in earnest. But something was different this time, something that Israeli military analysts had been watching with growing unease in the hills of Ukraine, and had perhaps convinced themselves would not arrive in Lebanon quite yet, had arrived. The FPV drone had come to the Middle East. FPV stands for first-person view. The concept originated in recreational drone racing. Pilots would strap a camera to a small quadcopter, put on a headset, and fly the drone as if they were sitting inside it. The view was immersive, precise, and exhilarating. What no one in the drone racing community could have predicted was that this technology would become one of the most lethal battlefield innovations of the 21st century. Russia's war against Ukraine changed everything. By 2023 and 2024, both sides in Ukraine were deploying FPV drones by the tens of thousands. Ukrainian operators became legendary for their precision, flying small, fast, agile quadcopters directly into the open hatches of Russian tanks, into engine compartments of armored personnel carriers, into clusters of infantry and trenches. Russian forces responded in kind. The sky above the front lines became a killing zone for anything that moved. Armored vehicles that once dominated open terrain were now being stalked from above by drones that cost $200 and could be built in a garage. Ukrainian drone operators estimated that somewhere between 70 and 80% of all battlefield casualties were being caused by aerial systems. Most of them small, most of them cheap, all of them ruthlessly effective. The military world was watching. Hezbollah was watching very carefully. March 25th, 2026. 3 weeks into the renewed Israeli ground campaign in southern Lebanon, Hezbollah releases a video. It shows an FPV drone, small, fast, camera-mounted, closing in on an Israeli Merkava Mark IV tank. The drone zeroes in on the rear of the vehicle. And this is not an accident. This is deliberate targeting doctrine. The rear of the Merkava, despite its exceptional overall protection, has thinner armor than the frontal arc. More importantly, this is where the tank's main ammunition storage is located. A penetrating hit to the rear is not just damaging, it can be catastrophic. The drone strikes, the video cuts. Hezbollah claims the tank is destroyed. Israeli military sensors scramble. The IDF does not officially acknowledge the incident. But that same day, military operational reports confirm that several soldiers from the 7th Brigade, an armored unit known to operate the Merkava Mark IV, had sustained injuries. One was killed. The connection between these two facts is not officially confirmed by Israel, but it does not need to be. The world is already watching the video. That was just the beginning. What followed over the next several weeks can only be described as a drone campaign of unprecedented scale and ambition in the history of Middle East conflict. March 26, 2026. A single day. 24 hours. Hezbollah announces it has struck 21 Israeli Merkava tanks, 21 in one day. To put that in context, during the entire Second Lebanon War in 2006, Israel lost around 50 tanks over 34 days of intense combat. Hezbollah is now claiming to exceed that pace by an enormous factor. Israeli sources have not confirmed the full number, but independent military analysts tracking the conflict noted that IDF operational tempo in certain sectors abruptly slowed, a classic sign of significant vehicle losses. In addition to the tanks, Hezbollah claimed strikes on 3 D9 Caterpillar armored bulldozers, the massive heavily armored engineering vehicles Israel uses to clear roads and destroy structures, and 2 militarized Humvees. Videos backed up many of these claims. Analysts studying the footage confirmed genuine strike capability. The hits were real. Some of the drones targeted open hatches on top of vehicles rather than just flying blindly at the hull. This was precision. This was deliberate tactical intelligence. This was not improvised chaos. This was a doctrine. April 2026, the campaign intensifies. Hezbollah releases a new category of footage that sends a chill through defense establishments far beyond Israel. These are not just FPV drones using conventional radio frequency guidance. These are fiber optic guided drones, and that distinction matters enormously. Here is why. Conventional FPV drones are guided by radio signals. The operator on the ground uses a controller and the drone receives commands via radio frequency. Israel's military vehicles carry sophisticated electronic warfare systems designed to jam exactly those frequencies. Jam the signal, lose the drone, it crashes harmlessly. Electronic jamming has been one of Israel's most reliable countermeasures against drone threats for years. Fiber optic drones throw that entire defense out the window. Instead of transmitting commands wirelessly, a fiber optic drone trails a spool of ultra-thin cable behind it as it flies. The commands travel through the cable. Light, not radio waves. Physics, not electronics. You cannot jam light moving through a glass fiber. You cannot interfere with it using radar or frequency disruption. The only ways to stop a fiber optic FPV drone are to physically intercept it, shoot it down, or hope the operator makes a mistake. That is it. Those are your options. Hezbollah had been deploying these systems, not just standard radio frequency FPVs that Israel might have prepared for, but the advanced, unjammable fiber optic guided variants that first appeared on the Ukrainian battlefield in spring 2024. The Israeli military initially assessed that Hezbollah's fiber optic drones could operate over distances of only a few kilometers. They were wrong. Later intelligence revealed that Hezbollah was launching these drones from distances of up to 15 kilometers, nearly 9 miles away from their targets. Think about what that means tactically. An Israeli tank column moving through southern Lebanon believes it is operating safely behind its lines. The forward edge of combat is kilometers away. The crew feels relatively secure. And then, from 9 miles away, a Hezbollah operator sitting in a fortified underground position watching a crystal-clear fiber optic video feed guides a drone at high speed directly onto the vehicle's top hatch. The crew never saw it coming. The electronic warfare systems did nothing. The trophy system may not have even detected it. The IDF was not ready for this, and that is perhaps the most stunning revelation of this entire conflict. On April 11th, 2026, the Israeli Defense Ministry's Directorate of Defense Research and Development did something remarkable. They issued a public call for solutions, an open invitation to anyone, defense contractors, startups, universities, individual engineers, to submit proposals for countering fiber optic guided drone threats. Let that settle in for a moment. One of the most sophisticated defense establishments on the planet, the country that developed the Iron Dome, the Aero Missile Defense System, the Trophy APS, the world's most advanced military surveillance drones, put out a public help wanted ad because it could not figure out how to stop drones built from parts you can order online. And the timing makes it even more striking. Fiber optic FPV drones first appeared on the Ukrainian battlefield in spring 2024. That is nearly 2 full years before Israel issued its call for solutions. 2 years during which the technology was proliferating, being refined, being discussed at defense conferences. 2 years during which Hezbollah, with full Iranian support and direct connections to the Russian military-industrial ecosystem, was quietly acquiring components, training operators, and building a fiber optic drone force. And Israel somehow did not have a counter ready. Why? The answer to that question is uncomfortable, and it reveals something profound about the nature of military institutions everywhere. Israel's military doctrine, for decades, was optimized for a specific kind of enemy. The wars it had fought most recently, in Gaza, in the 2006 Lebanon conflict, and various operations between, were primarily counterinsurgency and counter-rocket operations. Yes, Hezbollah had anti-tank guided missiles. Yes, Israeli tanks had faced those threats. But the electronic warfare suites on Israeli vehicles were designed to counter radio frequency guided threats. The trophy system was designed to intercept missiles and rockets, objects moving fast, in a ballistic arc, from a predictable direction. The entire Israeli armored doctrine was built around threats that had defined the last 20 years of Middle Eastern warfare. The FPV drone, small, slow by missile standards, top attacking, fiber optic guided, fit none of those parameters. It fell through every gap in the Israeli defense architecture simultaneously. It was too slow for Trophy's radar to reliably track. It was unjammable by electronic warfare. It was too small for conventional air defense systems to engage cost-effectively. And it was too cheap to deter through counter-battery fire. Because for every drone Hezbollah launches, Israel would need to expend weapons costing far more to respond. This is the fundamental economic reality of modern drone warfare. Hezbollah's FPV drones cost somewhere between $200 and a few $1,000s each. The Merkava tank they are targeting costs $4 million. The trophy system interceptor rounds cost tens of thousands of dollars each. The economic math is catastrophically lopsided. And it is Hezbollah that holds the advantage. Now let us talk about the human dimension of this story, because behind every tank, behind every piece of armor and every tactical map, there are young men and women. April 26, 2026, a Sunday morning. Southern Lebanon, the town of Taiba, inside an area Israel had declared a security zone. A ceasefire with Hezbollah was technically in effect. Israeli soldiers were doing what soldiers do during ceasefires: maintenance, repairs, the unglamorous but essential work of keeping vehicles operational. A group of soldiers was working on their tank in the open, exposed, focused on the mechanical problem in front of them. A drone appeared, small, fast, guided by a Hezbollah operator through a fiber optic cable from somewhere in the Lebanese hills. It slammed into the soldiers. The warhead detonated. Sergeant Aiden Fuchs, 19 years old, was killed. 6 other soldiers were wounded, 4 of them seriously. An Israeli Air Force helicopter was dispatched to evacuate the casualties. Medics worked frantically on the wounded. And then, Hezbollah struck again. 2 more drones incoming. 1 was intercepted. The second tore in low, crashing just meters from the soldiers and the waiting helicopter before exploding. No further deaths. But the message was unmistakable. Hezbollah was watching. Hezbollah knew exactly where the evacuation was happening, and Hezbollah was prepared to strike a second time to maximize casualties. This is the doctrine of compounding ambush that Ukrainian forces know all too well. Strike once, wait for the response, strike the responders. Sergeant Aiden Fuchs was 19 years old. He was the first Israeli soldier killed by an FPV drone strike. He will not be the last. Let us zoom out from the individual tragedy and look at the geopolitical architecture behind this drone campaign. Because Hezbollah does not operate in a vacuum. It operates as the most capable and most heavily armed proxy in what Iran calls its axis of resistance. A network of militant groups stretching from Yemen to Iraq to Syria to Lebanon, all supplied, funded, trained, and directed to varying degrees by Tehran. Iran's relationship with drone warfare is deep and strategic. Iran has been developing its own drone program since at least the 1990s. By the 2010s, Iranian drones, particularly the Shahed series of loitering munitions, had become one of the country's primary tools of asymmetric projection. Iran supplied Shahed drones to Russia after the Ukraine war began. Russia used them by the thousands to strike Ukrainian cities, power grids, and military infrastructure. The technological feedback loop then ran in reverse. Lessons learned in Ukraine flowed back through Iranian channels to its proxy networks across the Middle East. Hezbollah received the benefits of that knowledge transfer in a particularly concentrated form, because Hezbollah is not a simple proxy. It is arguably the most sophisticated non-state military organization in the world. During the years of relative quiet between 2024 and 2026, while the world's attention was elsewhere, Hezbollah was rebuilding not just its rocket stockpiles and its tunnel networks. It was absorbing lessons, studying Ukraine, training operators, acquiring fiber optic cable in bulk, because even at $30 per kilometer, you can field enormous operational range for modest cost. building and testing FPV airframes. Israel does not have years. Tactically, Israeli commanders are adapting their operational patterns, keeping vehicles moving, reducing predictable routines, increasing overhead cover, and changing crew behavior. Because one of the most important lessons of this campaign is that the crews inside the tanks are not always the primary targets. The drone strikes causing the most casualties have hit soldiers outside their vehicles, soldiers performing maintenance, soldiers evacuating casualties. The April 26th attack that killed Sergeant Fuchs hit soldiers repairing their tank, exposed, focused on their work, not scanning the sky. The follow-up strike targeted the medical evacuation. Strike once, wait for the response. Strike the responders. Changing that behavior is perhaps the most immediate actionable response available to Israeli commanders. But it is a profoundly difficult cultural change to enforce in the middle of active combat when every instinct tells a soldier to rush toward a fallen comrade. Meanwhile, the 2026 Lebanon war has already displaced over 1 million people, 20% of Lebanon's entire population. More than 2,000 militants and civilians have been killed. Israeli forces from multiple divisions are operating across a vast swath of southern Lebanon with the stated goal of pushing Hezbollah north of the Litani River, 30 kilometers from the Israeli border. It means Israeli forces must advance through and hold terrain that Hezbollah has spent years preparing to defend with exactly these tools. The ceasefire announced on April 17th is already fraying. Hezbollah continues launching rockets and drones. Israel continues airstrikes and ground operations. Lebanon's government presses for withdrawal. Israel wants to dismantle Hezbollah infrastructure. The United States watches nervously while managing separate tensions with Iran over nuclear negotiations. All of this geopolitical complexity plays out against the backdrop of drone strikes that are, one by one, reshaping what is possible on the ground. What does the future of armored warfare look like in a world where a $200 drone can threaten a $4 million tank? The honest answer is that no one fully knows. We are living through the doctrinal revolution in real time. But several things are becoming clear. The era of armored vehicles as dominant, largely invulnerable tools of ground power is ending. Not because tanks are obsolete, they're not, but because their operational parameters have changed fundamentally. A tank that once could advance with relative confidence across open terrain must now treat every meter of open sky as a potential kill zone. The psychological and operational burden of that shift cannot be overstated. Commanders who once positioned tanks as shock tools, visible, dominant, fear-inducing, must now think about every movement as a potential exposure event. Electronic warfare, which has been the dominant counter-drone strategy for most militaries over the past decade, is no longer sufficient on its own. Fiber optic guidance has created a category of drone threat that is physically immune to jamming. The kinetic interception problem must be solved from first principles, and solving it cheaply, reliably, and at scale is the central challenge facing every defense establishment on Earth today. The economic equation of warfare has shifted in ways that favor decentralized, asymmetric actors in a way never before seen in modern conflict. When the cost ratio between offensive drone and defensive interceptor is 100 to 1 in favor of the attacker, the defender faces unsustainable attrition economics over time. This is not just a tactical problem, it is a strategic one. It changes the calculus of what it means to project power, to hold territory, to wage prolonged campaigns, and the technology is not going back. The knowledge of how to build and operate fiber optic guided FPV drones is now distributed across dozens of armed groups on every continent. The components are cheap, commercially available, and getting cheaper every year. What Hezbollah is doing in Lebanon today, other groups are watching and learning from. The question is not whether this technology will proliferate further. It will. The question is whether the world's militaries will adapt their doctrine and their equipment fast enough to meet a threat that evolves faster than any procurement cycle can match. Sergeant Aiden Fuchs was 19 years old. He served in one of the most technologically advanced armies in the world, inside one of the most heavily protected military vehicles ever built. And he was killed by a drone assembled from components you could find in a hobby shop. A drone that cost hundreds of dollars, against a tank that cost $4 million. That gap, that brutal widening gap, is the story of this war. That is not a story about Israeli failure alone. That is a story about the nature of technological change in warfare, how advantages that seem permanent are always temporary, how the most powerful weapon of one era becomes the vulnerability of the next, and how the battlefield always finds a way to humble the overconfident. Every great military power has faced this moment, the moment when the old way of fighting stops working and the new way has already begun. Israel will adapt. Its defense industry is extraordinary, and its military tradition of rapid innovation is without peer. Trophy will be upgraded, counter-drone systems will be fielded, doctrine will change. The engineers and tacticians of the IDF are already working around the clock on this problem because they have no choice. History guarantees that much, but right now, tonight, in the hills and the olive groves and the shattered villages of southern Lebanon, Hezbollah drones are in the air. They are small,